The women of Cedar Falls gathered at Martha's tea table every Tuesday, their voices sharp as winter wind. They spoke of failures and broken dreams, of women who couldn't fulfill their purpose. Today, their target sat silent in the corner. Cynthia Morrison, 26 years old, married 3 years, and still no child to show for it. "Send her to the cowboy up north," one laughed cruelly. "Maybe he can fix what her husband can't." The laughter echoed through the parlor, but none of them knew that sometimes the cruelest jokes become the greatest truths. What happened next would shake Cedar Falls to its foundation and prove that miracles don't always come from where you expect. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the main street of Cedar Falls, Colorado, painting the dusty road in shades of gold and amber. The year was 1892, and the small mountain town nestled between rolling hills and pine forests buzzed with the kind of gossip that could make or break a woman's reputation. At the heart of it all stood the Morrison house, a modest 2-story home with white picket fence and roses climbing the front porch, looking picture-perfect from the outside. Inside, Cynthia Morrison stood at her kitchen window, watching the neighbors' children chase each other through the yard next door. Her fingers traced the rim of her coffee cup, now grown cold in her hands. The familiar ache settled in her chest, the one that never quite left her alone. 3 years of marriage, countless prayers, and still her arms remained empty. "Cynthia!" Her husband's voice boomed from the front hall. Thomas Morrison was a good man. Everyone in Cedar Falls agreed on that. He ran the hardware store with honest hands and fair prices, attended church every Sunday without fail, and treated his wife with the kind of respectful distance that proper society expected. But good wasn't the same as understanding. And respect wasn't the same as warmth. She turned as he entered the kitchen, his face already set with the expression she'd come to recognize, duty mixed with disappointment. "The Hendersons are expecting their 4th, he said, hanging his hat on the peg by the door. "Doc Williams announced it at the store this morning." Cynthia nodded, her throat tight. "That's wonderful for them." Thomas studied her face, searching for something he couldn't name. "Cynthia, perhaps we should speak with Doc Williams again. Maybe there's something—" "He's already told us there's nothing wrong that he can find," she interrupted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sometimes these things just don't happen." But Thomas shook his head, his jaw setting in that stubborn line she knew too well. "There has to be something. Henderson's been talking to the men about that cowboy up in Millbrook. Says he's got a reputation for helping women with certain difficulties." Heat flooded Cynthia's cheeks. The cowboy of Millbrook. She'd heard the whispered stories, the crude jokes, the knowing looks that passed between married women when they thought unmarried girls weren't listening. Dakota Reed, they called him, though nobody seemed to know if that was really his name. A drifter who'd settled in the mountains north of Cedar Falls, living alone on a spread of land that seemed to produce nothing but wild horses and wilder rumors. "Thomas, you can't be serious." Her husband's face hardened. "I'm serious about wanting a family, Cynthia. About wanting sons to carry on the Morrison name. If modern medicine can't help us, maybe we need to consider other options." The words hung between them like smoke from a dying fire. Other options. As if she were a broken piece of machinery that needed fixing, a problem to be solved by any means necessary. Cynthia set down her cup with shaking hands. "What are you suggesting?" Thomas looked away, unable to meet her eyes. "Just talk to him. See if there's truth to the stories. The Peterson woman from Millbrook, they say she was barren for 8 years. Then she spent a week at Dakota Reed's place, and 9 months later—" "Stop!" Cynthia's voice cut through the air like a blade. "Just stop!" But Thomas pressed on, his voice growing desperate. "Margaret Clearwater from the next county over. Married 15 years, with nothing to show for it. 1 visit to the cowboy, and now she's got twins. Cynthia, if there's even a chance, you're talking about sending your wife to another man." The words came out flat, emotionless, though inside she felt as if she were drowning. "Do you understand what you're asking?" For a moment, Thomas looked ashamed. But then his face hardened again, and she saw the truth that had been growing between them like poison ivy. His embarrassment at their childless state had finally outweighed his love for her. "I'm asking you to consider every possibility. The Morrison line doesn't die with me, Cynthia. It can't." She stared at him, this man she'd married with such hope 3 years ago. Thomas Morrison, with his neat mustache and careful manners, his Sunday suits and ledger books. A man who measured worth in profits and losses, in tangible results. A man who saw her failure to conceive as a business problem requiring a business solution. "And if I refuse?" Thomas straightened his collar, suddenly unable to look at her. "Then perhaps you should spend some time thinking about what kind of wife you want to be. What kind of legacy you want to leave." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. In 1892, a woman's security depended entirely on her husband's goodwill. Divorce was scandalous and financially devastating for women. A wife who couldn't produce children and refused to find alternative solutions might find herself facing a very uncertain future. After Thomas left for the store, Cynthia sat alone in her perfect kitchen with its cheerful yellow curtains and polished surfaces. Everything in place, everything proper, everything hollow as a gourd. She thought about the women at Martha Fairweather's weekly gatherings, how they'd dropped their voices to whispers whenever she entered the room lately, how they'd started talking about remedies and doctors and folk cures, always with that mixture of pity and judgment that made her skin crawl. Martha Fairweather herself was the worst of them, the unofficial queen of Cedar Falls society, a woman who'd produced 6 healthy children and never let anyone forget it. Her Tuesday gatherings had become trials by jury, with Cynthia as the defendant in a case she couldn't win. The afternoon wore on, and Cynthia found herself walking to the cemetery at the edge of town. She often came here when the weight of expectation became too heavy to bear. The headstones told stories of lives lived and lost, of children who died too young and women who died too old and tired. She stopped at a small marker near the back. Mary Catherine Morrison, 1863–1864. Thomas's sister, who'd lived only 8 months. There were others scattered throughout the cemetery, tiny stones marking brief lives. Reminders that even women who could conceive didn't always get to keep their children. But that didn't matter to the women of Cedar Falls. All they saw was her empty arms, her flat belly, her failure to fulfill what they considered a woman's most basic function. As the sun began to set, painting the mountains in shades of purple and gold, Cynthia heard footsteps on the gravel path behind her. She turned to see Reverend Samuel Hayes approaching, his face kind but concerned. "Mrs. Morrison," he said gently, "I hope you're finding peace here." Cynthia managed a weak smile. "As much as can be found anywhere, I suppose." The Reverend was quiet for a moment, studying the headstone at her feet. "Children are a blessing," he said finally, "but they're not the only blessing the Lord provides. Sometimes he has different plans for us than we have for ourselves." "Tell that to my husband," Cynthia replied, unable to keep the bitterness from her voice. "Tell that to the women who gather at Martha Fairweather's house every Tuesday to discuss my shortcomings over tea and cake." Reverend Hayes sighed. "People can be cruel when they're afraid, and childlessness frightens them because it reminds them that some things are beyond their control. But you are not defined by what you lack, Mrs. Morrison. You are defined by who you are." His words were meant to comfort, but they couldn't ease the pressure building in her chest. Because who was she really if not Thomas Morrison's wife? What place did she have in a world that measured women's worth by their ability to produce the next generation? That evening, Thomas returned home with a sheet of paper clutched in his hand. "I've got the directions," he said without preamble. "Dakota Reed's place is about 2 days' ride north of here. There's a trail that follows Miller's Creek up into the high country." Cynthia looked up from her sewing, her hands stilling on the fabric. "Thomas, I've arranged for you to take the wagon. Peterson's boy will drive you up and back. Make sure you get there safely." His voice was businesslike, as if he were discussing a trip to Denver for supplies. "He'll wait in Millbrook while you handle your business." The casual way he said it made her stomach turn. Handle your business. As if her potential infidelity were just another item on his endless list of tasks to be completed. What if the stories aren't true? She asked quietly. What if Dakota Reed is just a man living alone in the mountains, and all these rumors are just rumors? Thomas shrugged. Then you'll have taken a nice trip to the mountains and gotten some fresh air. But if there's even a chance, Cynthia, we have to try. She set down her sewing and looked at her husband, really looked at him. When had the lines around his eyes become so deep? When did his smile become so rare? The pressure of their childless marriage was killing him too, she realized. Killing them both in different ways. And if I do this thing, she said carefully, if I go to this man and somehow come back with a child, what then? How do we explain it? How do we live with it? Thomas's face hardened. We explain it however we need to. A miraculous blessing. An answered prayer. The details don't matter, Cynthia. Only the result matters. That night, she lay awake staring at the ceiling while Thomas slept peacefully beside her. His breathing was even and untroubled, the sleep of a man who'd solved a difficult problem. But Cynthia's mind raced with questions that had no good answers. What kind of man was Dakota Reed, really? What kind of woman did this thing make her? And what would happen to whatever child might come from such an arrangement? Would they grow up never knowing their true father? Would they inherit something wild and untamed from the mysterious cowboy in the mountains? But beneath all those questions lay a deeper, more painful truth. She wanted a child so desperately that she was actually considering this impossible, scandalous plan. The ache in her arms had become so fierce that even the thought of holding a baby, any baby, however it came to be, made her chest tight with longing. As the first pale light of dawn crept through her bedroom window, Cynthia Morrison made a decision that would change everything. Not because she believed in the stories about Dakota Reed's supposed abilities, not because she thought it was right or moral or proper, but because the alternative, a lifetime of empty arms and disappointed looks and whispered conversations, seemed worse than any scandal. She would go to the mountains. She would meet this mysterious cowboy who lived alone in the high country. And whatever happened there, whatever the cost, she would finally take control of her own story. The women of Cedar Falls had laughed when they suggested sending her to Dakota Reed. They'd meant it as a cruel joke, another way to highlight her inadequacy. But sometimes the cruelest jokes become the most powerful truths. By the time Thomas woke that morning, Cynthia was already packing her traveling bag. The morning mist clung to the valley floor like gossamer as Cynthia stepped onto the front porch of her home, traveling bag in hand. The leather satchel contained 3 days' worth of clothing, her mother's silver brush, and a small Bible that had belonged to her grandmother. She'd packed light, uncertain how long this journey might take or what she might need in the wild country ahead. Billy Peterson sat perched on the wagon seat, his young face serious beneath a worn felt hat. At 19, he was one of the few unmarried men in Cedar Falls who could be trusted with such a delicate mission. His father had raised him to be discreet and reliable, qualities that made him invaluable for errands that required both skill and silence. "Morning, Mrs. Morrison," Billy said, tipping his hat. "Wagons loaded with supplies. Should make good time if the weather holds." Cynthia nodded, accepting his hand as she climbed onto the wooden seat beside him. The early morning air carried the scent of pine and wildflowers, promising a beautiful day for travel. But beauty couldn't ease the knot of anxiety in her stomach or quiet the voice in her head that whispered she was making a terrible mistake. As Billy guided the horses down Main Street, Cynthia caught sight of curtains twitching in windows, faces peering out to watch her departure. By noon, every woman in Cedar Falls would know that Cynthia Morrison had left town with young Peterson, heading north toward the mountains. The speculation would be merciless. They passed the schoolhouse where children were already gathering for morning lessons, their laughter bright and carefree. Cynthia's chest tightened as she watched a little girl with golden braids skip up the front steps, her lunch pail swinging from her arm. Would she ever see her own child run to school with such joy? Or was she chasing an impossible dream that would only lead to heartbreak? The wagon rolled past the church where she'd been married 3 years ago, past the cemetery where she'd stood yesterday contemplating the brief lives marked by tiny headstones. Soon they were beyond the town limits, following the dusty road that wound through pastures dotted with cattle and sheep. The familiar landmarks of her everyday life fell away behind them, and with each mile, Cynthia felt herself moving into territory, both literal and metaphorical, that she'd never imagined entering. "Have you ever been up to Millbrook before, Billy?" she asked, needing to break the silence that had settled between them. The young man shook his head. "No, ma'am. But my pa traded horses with a fellow from up that way last spring. Said it was a rough country, but beautiful. Lots of wild game, fresh streams, air so clean it burns your lungs at first." They followed Miller's Creek as it wound through increasingly rugged terrain, the road becoming more of a track as they climbed higher into the foothills. Aspen trees lined the water, their leaves already beginning to show hints of the gold they'd become in a few weeks. The sound of rushing water provided a constant accompaniment to the creak of wagon wheels and the steady clip-clop of the horses' hooves. Around midday, they stopped beside a grove of cottonwoods to rest the animals and eat the lunch Billy's mother had packed. Cold chicken, fresh bread, and apples from their own orchard. Simple food that tasted like civilization and safety. Cynthia found herself savoring each bite, wondering what meals would be like in the days ahead. "Mrs. Morrison," Billy said carefully as they prepared to continue their journey, "I hope you don't mind me asking, but are you sure about this? I mean, the stories about this Dakota Reed fellow, some of them are pretty wild." Cynthia looked at the young man's earnest face, seeing genuine concern there. "What kind of stories, Billy?" He shifted uncomfortably, clearly wishing he hadn't brought up the subject. "Well, some say he's got Indian blood, that he learned medicine from the tribes up north. Others claim he's got some kind of gift, that he can see things other folks can't." Billy lowered his voice. "And then there are those who say he's dangerous, that women go up there and come back changed." A chill ran down Cynthia's spine despite the warm afternoon sun. "Changed how?" "Different. Wilder, some say. Like they've seen something or learned something that sets them apart from regular folk." Billy gathered the reins, his expression troubled. "My ma says a woman from over in Pine Ridge went up there last year. When she came back, she left her husband and moved to Denver. Just packed up and went, leaving behind everything she'd ever known." The story sent a flutter of unease through Cynthia's chest. But was that necessarily a bad thing? She wondered. Perhaps some women needed to be changed, needed to discover parts of themselves they'd never known existed. Perhaps change was exactly what she was seeking, even if she couldn't admit it to herself. As the afternoon wore on, the landscape became increasingly dramatic. Towering cliffs rose on either side of the track, and the creek tumbled over rocky outcroppings in a series of waterfalls that caught the sunlight like scattered diamonds. Wildlife was abundant here, deer grazing in meadows, hawks circling overhead, and once, in the distance, a black bear ambling through a stand of pine trees. "Gets lonely up here," Billy observed, his voice echoing slightly off the canyon walls. "I can see why a man might choose this kind of solitude, but it'd drive me crazy after a while." Cynthia said nothing, but she found herself understanding the appeal. There was something liberating about being so far from the watchful eyes and wagging tongues of Cedar Falls. Here, surrounded by wilderness that had existed long before humans arrived to impose their rules and expectations, she felt a strange sense of freedom beginning to unfurl in her chest. They made camp that evening beside a natural pool formed by the creek. The water so clear, Cynthia could see smooth stones on the bottom, even in the fading light. Billy tended to the horses while she gathered firewood, both of them working in companionable silence. The young man proved to be an experienced outdoorsman, quickly building a fire and preparing a simple but satisfying dinner of beans, bacon, and coffee strong enough to wake the dead as darkness settled over the mountains. The stars appeared with a brilliance Cynthia had never experienced in town. The Milky Way stretched across the sky like a river of light, and she found herself staring upward in wonder. "Makes you feel small, doesn't it?" Billy said, following her gaze. "Small," Cynthia agreed, "but also part of something bigger, something that doesn't care about our little problems and worries." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the fire burn down to glowing coals. An owl called from somewhere in the darkness, answered by another from across the creek. The sound was haunting and beautiful, unlike anything in her civilized world. "Billy," Cynthia said eventually, "if someone asked you why you thought I was making this journey, what would you tell them?" The young man considered the question carefully. "I'd tell them it wasn't my business to know. But if I had to guess—" He poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling into the night air. "I'd say you were looking for something you couldn't find at home." His words hit closer to the truth than she'd expected. "And what if what I'm looking for doesn't exist? What if I'm chasing stories and legends?" Billy shrugged. "Then at least you'll know. Sometimes the searching is more important than the finding." That night, wrapped in her blankets beneath the vast canopy of stars, Cynthia dreamed of running water and wind through pine trees. She dreamed of children's laughter echoing off canyon walls, and of a man with eyes the color of storm clouds who watched her from the shadows but never spoke. When she woke, the dream faded quickly, leaving only the memory of feeling completely, perfectly at peace. The second day of travel took them higher into the mountains, following an increasingly narrow track that seemed barely wide enough for the wagon. The air grew thinner and colder, requiring Cynthia to wrap her shawl more tightly around her shoulders. But the scenery was breathtaking, alpine meadows carpeted with wildflowers, snow-capped peaks rising in the distance, and eagles soaring on thermals high above. Late in the afternoon, they crested a ridge and saw Millbrook spread out below them, a collection of perhaps 20 buildings clustered around a main street, with smoke rising from chimneys and horses tied to hitching posts. It looked like a town that had grown up organically around the needs of miners, ranchers, and mountain men, without the careful planning that characterized places like Cedar Falls. "There it is," Billy said, pointing toward a trail that branched off from the main road and wound up into the high country beyond the town. "That track leads to Dakota Reed's place, according to the directions your husband got. Another hour's ride, maybe two." Cynthia's heart began to pound as reality crashed over her. In a few hours, she would meet the mysterious cowboy who had become the subject of so many whispered stories. She would look into his eyes and try to determine if he was a charlatan, a healer, or something else entirely. And then she would have to decide whether to trust him with the most desperate hope of her heart. As they descended toward Millbrook, Cynthia caught herself scanning the mountainsides, wondering if Dakota Reed might be watching even now. The thought sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Whatever happened next, she was crossing a line from which there might be no return. But after 3 years of empty arms and disappointed dreams, she was finally ready to take that step into the unknown. The trail to Dakota Reed's ranch wound through a landscape that seemed untouched by human ambition. Ancient pines towered overhead, their branches filtering the late afternoon sunlight into golden columns that danced with floating dust motes. The path was narrow, barely wide enough for a single horse, and carved into the mountainside with switchbacks that revealed breathtaking vistas at every turn. Billy had stayed behind in Millbrook, securing rooms at the modest boarding house and tending to the horses. The arrangement was necessary for propriety's sake, but it meant Cynthia faced this final leg of her journey alone, mounted on a gentle mare Billy had rented from the livery stable. Her traveling bag was secured behind the saddle, and her heart hammered against her ribs. With each step the horse took higher into the wilderness. The stories she'd heard about Dakota Reed tumbled through her mind as she rode. Some painted him as a healer blessed with supernatural gifts, others as a dangerous man who preyed on desperate women. But all agreed on one thing: he was unlike anyone in the civilized world below. Living alone in the high country, he answered to no church, no town council, no social expectations. He was a law unto himself in this realm of stone and sky. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, Cynthia rounded a bend and gasped. Before her lay a valley she hadn't known existed, hidden in the heart of the mountains like a secret kept by the earth itself. A crystalline stream meandered through meadows dotted with wildflowers, and at the far end, nestled against a backdrop of towering cliffs, stood a log cabin that seemed to have grown from the landscape itself. But it was the horses that truly took her breath away. Dozens of them grazed in the meadow, mustangs in every color imaginable, from coal black to snow white, with roans and buckskins and paint scattered among them like living artwork. They moved with a freedom she'd never seen in domesticated animals, their heads high and alert, their bodies flowing like water across the grassland, and standing among them, so still he might have been carved from the mountain stone, was a man. Even at this distance, Cynthia could see he was tall and broad-shouldered, his dark hair catching the last rays of sunlight. He wore simple clothes, leather chaps, a faded shirt, boots that had seen countless miles of rough country. But there was something about the way he stood, the way the horses moved around him without fear, that spoke of a connection to this wild place that went deeper than mere residence. Dakota Reed. It had to be. Her mare nickered softly, and the sound carried across the valley like a bell. The man turned, and even across the distance, Cynthia felt the impact of his gaze. He raised one hand in greeting, not a wave exactly, but an acknowledgement of her presence that somehow conveyed both welcome and wariness. The path down into the valley was steep and treacherous, requiring all of Cynthia's attention as her horse picked its way carefully among loose stones and exposed roots. By the time they reached the valley floor, the sun had disappeared behind the mountains, leaving the sky painted in shades of rose and gold that seemed to set the very air on fire. Dakota Reed waited beside the stream, close enough now that Cynthia could see the details that stories had failed to capture. He was perhaps 35 years old, with weathered skin that spoke of a life lived entirely outdoors. His eyes were indeed the color of storm clouds, shifting between gray and blue, depending on the light. His hair was longer than fashion dictated, tied back with a strip of leather. And his hands, she noticed his hands immediately, were large and capable, with the kind of calluses that came from honest work. But it was his stillness that struck her most profoundly. He possessed the utter quiet of a predator at rest, a sense that he could explode into motion at any moment, but chose restraint instead. When he spoke, his voice was deeper than she'd expected, roughened by wind and solitude. "You'd be Mrs. Morrison from Cedar Falls." It wasn't a question, and Cynthia found herself wondering how he could possibly know. "Yes," she managed, suddenly aware of how out of place she must look in her traveling dress and polished boots. "You're Dakota Reed." He nodded once, his gaze taking in everything about her in a single sweep, her posture in the saddle, the way she held the reins, the careful arrangement of her skirts. "Long ride up from town. Your horse needs water and rest." Without waiting for her response, he took the mare's bridle and led them toward a corral near the cabin. His movements were economical, practiced, and Cynthia found herself studying the way he interacted with her horse. The animal, which had been skittish and nervous during the climb, immediately calmed under his touch. It was as if he spoke a language that transcended human speech. "I'll tend to her," Dakota said, helping Cynthia dismount with hands that were surprisingly gentle. "You can wait on the porch while I get her settled." The cabin was larger than it had appeared from a distance, built with the kind of craftsmanship that could only come from a man who intended to stay. The logs were perfectly fitted, the chinking tight against mountain weather, and the covered porch held simple furniture made from local wood. Cynthia settled into a chair that had been positioned to overlook the valley and found herself mesmerized by the sight of the wild horses moving like ghosts through the gathering dusk. When Dakota returned, he carried 2 cups of coffee and moved with the fluid grace of someone completely at home in his environment. He handed her 1 cup and settled into the chair beside her, close enough that she could catch his scent, leather and wood smoke and something wild that might have been the mountain air itself. "Your husband sent you up here?" he asked without preamble. The directness of the question caught Cynthia off guard. "How did you—" Word travels fast in small places. Millbrook's got maybe 50 souls, and they all know when strangers arrive asking for directions to my ranch. Dakota sipped his coffee, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "The question is whether you came because you wanted to, or because someone else wanted you to." Cynthia felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Does it matter?" "Matters to me. I don't take kindly to being used as a solution to other people's problems." His voice carried no judgment, only a matter-of-fact assessment that somehow stung more than anger would have. For a long moment, they sat in silence. The last light faded from the sky, and stars began to appear with the startling suddenness of high altitude. An owl called from somewhere in the darkness, and one of the horses whinnied softly in response. "I've been married 3 years," Cynthia said finally, surprised by her own willingness to share such personal information with this stranger. "No children. In a place like Cedar Falls, that makes me—" She struggled for the right word. "Broken," Dakota supplied quietly. "Yes." The admission felt like a physical weight leaving her chest. "Thomas, my husband, he's heard stories about you. About women who come here and leave different." Dakota turned to look at her directly for the first time since they'd begun talking. In the starlight, his eyes seemed to hold depths she couldn't fathom. "Different how?" "With children. After years of trying, after doctors saying it was impossible." Cynthia's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Is it true?" Instead of answering directly, Dakota stood and walked to the porch railing. He stood there for a long time, seeming to commune with the darkness and the wild horses moving unseen through the meadow. "Below, tell me about your life in Cedar Falls," he said eventually. The question seemed unrelated to her purpose for being there, but something in his tone suggested it was anything but casual. So Cynthia found herself talking about the Tuesday gatherings at Martha Fairweather's house, about the whispered conversations that stopped when she entered a room, about the weight of expectation that pressed down on her like a physical burden. She told him about Thomas's growing desperation, about Doc Williams's inability to find anything medically wrong, about the crushing loneliness of being surrounded by people who saw her only as a failure. Dakota listened without interruption, his presence somehow making it easier to voice truths she'd never spoken aloud. When she finally fell silent, he returned to his chair and studied her face in the dim light. "You know why the horses stay here?" he asked. Cynthia blinked at the apparent change of subject. "I assumed you'd captured them. Never captured a horse in my life. They come here because this valley's safe. No predators, good water, grass that stays green most of the year. But mainly because nobody tries to break them." He gestured toward the meadow, where shapes moved like shadows in the starlight. "They're wild things living wild lives. The moment someone tries to put a bridle on them, tries to make them into something they're not, they disappear back into the mountains." The metaphor wasn't lost on Cynthia. "You're saying I'm like them. I'm saying maybe you need to figure out what kind of life you actually want before you start trying to fix the one you've got." Dakota's voice was gentle but uncompromising. "A baby won't solve what's broken between you and your husband. It won't make the women in your town respect you, and it sure won't make you happy if you're living someone else's version of what your life should be." The words hit Cynthia like cold water. She'd been so focused on the goal of conceiving a child that she'd never questioned whether that goal would actually address the deeper emptiness she carried. Would having a baby really change anything fundamental about her marriage, her place in Cedar Falls society, her own sense of worth? "The women who come here," she said carefully. "The ones who leave with children. How do you—" Dakota was quiet for so long that Cynthia began to wonder if he would answer at all. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of secrets shared reluctantly. "I don't give them babies. I give them permission to be themselves, to stop trying so hard to fit into shapes that were never meant for them, to listen to what their bodies and hearts are actually telling them instead of what other people think they should want." He paused, his gaze finding hers in the darkness. Amazing how often that's all it takes. Cynthia felt something shift inside her chest, like a door opening that had been locked for years. "Permission," she repeated softly. "Permission to want what you want instead of what you're supposed to want. Permission to live according to your own nature instead of someone else's expectations. Permission to be wild if that's what your spirit requires." Dakota stood again, moving to the edge of the porch where he could see the horses. Some women find that freedom and discover they can conceive. Others find it and realize they never really wanted children in the first place. They just wanted to belong somewhere. The revelation was staggering. Cynthia had been so certain that her desperate desire for a child was genuine, had never questioned whether it might be born from societal pressure rather than authentic maternal instinct. But now, sitting in this hidden valley under a canopy of stars, she found herself examining that assumption for the first time. Did she want a baby because her arms ached to hold one? Or because motherhood was the only role her world offered that came with unquestioned respect and purpose? Did she dream of lullabies and first steps, or of finally belonging somewhere, of finally being seen as valuable? "I don't know," she whispered, the admission feeling like both a loss and a liberation. "I don't know what I actually want anymore." Dakota nodded, as if this was exactly what he'd expected to hear. "That's a good place to start. Most people spend their whole lives wanting things without ever asking themselves why." A comfortable silence settled between them, filled with the sounds of the mountain night, wind through pine trees, the distant call of coyotes, the soft movements of horses in the meadow below. Cynthia felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the absence of pressure. No one here expected her to be anything other than exactly what she was at this moment. "Stay as long as you need," Dakota said eventually. "The cabin's got a spare room, and there's always plenty of food. When you're ready to go back down the mountain, I'll make sure you get there safely." Cynthia looked at this strange man who lived among wild horses and seemed to understand truths that eluded everyone else. "And if I decide I want to stay longer? If I need time to figure out who I really am underneath all the expectations?" For the first time since she'd arrived, Dakota Reed smiled. It transformed his entire face, revealing a warmth that the stories had never mentioned. "Then you stay. The horses have been here for 3 years, and they're still figuring themselves out. Time doesn't mean much up here." As if summoned by his words, one of the horses emerged from the darkness, a paint mare with a coat like scattered stars. She approached the porch cautiously, her ears pricked forward with curiosity rather than fear. When she reached the steps, she extended her muzzle towards Cynthia, breathing softly against her outstretched hand. The touch was electric, connecting Cynthia to something primal and free that she'd forgotten existed within herself. The mare's eyes reflected the starlight, wild and unbroken, and Cynthia saw her own reflection there, not the failure from Cedar Falls, not the desperate wife seeking impossible solutions, but a woman capable of choosing her own path. For the first time in 3 years, Cynthia Morrison smiled without forcing it. Dawn broke over the hidden valley like a benediction, painting the mountain peaks in shades of coral and gold. Cynthia woke in the spare room of Dakota's cabin to sounds she'd never heard before, the soft nickering of horses, the whisper of wind through pine boughs, and underneath it all, a profound silence that spoke of vast spaces and untroubled skies. She'd slept better than she had in months, wrapped in quilts that smelled of mountain air and cedar wood. The bed was simple but comfortable, and the small window beside it framed a view of the meadow where the wild horses grazed in the early morning light. As she watched, A foal no more than a few weeks old gamboled between its mother's legs, all awkward energy and boundless joy. The sight stirred something deep in Cynthia's chest, not the familiar ache of longing, but something altogether different. Wonder, perhaps, or recognition of a kind of happiness that had nothing to do with human expectations or social roles. A soft knock at the door interrupted her reverie. "Mrs. Morrison? Coffee's ready when you are." Dakota's voice carried none of the awkwardness she might have expected after their conversation the night before. If anything, he sounded more relaxed, as if her presence in his sanctuary was as natural as the sunrise itself. She dressed quickly in her traveling clothes, then joined him on the porch where he'd set out breakfast: fresh eggs, bacon and biscuits that were somehow both hearty and delicate. The coffee was strong enough to wake the dead, but flavored with something she couldn't identify that made it smooth and almost sweet. "Chicory," Dakota explained, noticing her questioning look. "Grows wild up here in the summer. Gives the coffee a different character than what you're used to in town." They ate in comfortable silence, watching the horses move through their morning routines. Cynthia found herself fascinated by their social dynamics, the way younger animals deferred to older ones, how certain mares seemed to serve as sentinels while others grazed, the complex communication that happened through ear positions and subtle body language. "How long have you been here?" she asked eventually. "5 years this autumn. Came up here after—" Dakota paused, seeming to weigh how much to reveal. "After I realized I wasn't cut out for the life people expected me to live." There was a story there, Cynthia sensed, but she didn't press. Instead, she found herself sharing something she'd never told another living soul. "When I was a girl, maybe 10 years old, I used to sneak out of the house at night and walk to the edge of town. There was a hill there where I could see for miles in every direction, just empty prairie and sky. I'd sit there for hours, feeling like I could breathe for the first time all day." She traced the rim of her coffee cup with one finger. "My mother caught me once and gave me the thrashing of my life. Said proper young ladies didn't wander alone in the darkness like wild things." Dakota studied her face with those storm-colored eyes. "But you kept going back, for a while." "Until the guilt became stronger than the need." Cynthia's voice grew quiet. "I haven't thought about those nights in years. Sitting here, watching your horses, it all came rushing back. The need for space, for silence, for connection to something bigger than the small world people try to squeeze you into." Dakota nodded slowly. "Some folks are born with that hunger. Trying to ignore it is like trying to hold your breath forever. Eventually, you either find a way to breathe or you suffocate." After breakfast, Dakota surprised her by saddling 2 horses, a gentle sorrel mare for her, and a massive black gelding that seemed to move like liquid shadow. "Thought you might like to see more of the valley," he said. "If you're going to understand this place, you need to experience it properly." The ride was unlike anything Cynthia had ever experienced. Dakota led her along trails that seemed invisible until they were upon them, winding through groves of aspen where the leaves whispered secrets in the morning breeze. They climbed to a high meadow where wildflowers stretched to the horizon, Indian paintbrush and lupine, columbine and mountain daisies, creating a tapestry of color that took her breath away. "This is where I found them," Dakota said, gesturing toward a group of mares grazing in the distance. 3 years ago, in the middle of a blizzard, they'd been driven out of their home range by a wildfire and were dying of cold and hunger. Took me most of the winter to convince them I wasn't a threat. Cynthia watched the horses, noting how they lifted their heads to acknowledge Dakota's presence, but showed no fear. "They trust you completely." Trust isn't the right word. "They know I won't try to change them, won't try to make them into something they're not. That's rare enough in this world that it's worth staying for." His voice carried a weight of experience that spoke of lessons learned. The hard way, they dismounted near a natural spring that bubbled up from the rocks, forming a clear pool before flowing down to join the stream in the valley below. Dakota knelt and cupped the water in his hands, drinking deeply. "Purest water you'll ever taste." Comes from snow that fell on these peaks maybe 100 years ago, filtered through miles of rock and time. Cynthia followed his example, gasping at the cold, clean taste that seemed to wash away more than just thirst. There was something almost ceremonial about drinking from this ancient source, as if she were participating in a ritual older than human memory. "Dakota," she said, as they sat beside the spring, "the women who come here, do they all find what they're looking for?" "They find something. Whether it's what they thought they were looking for is a different question entirely." He picked up a smooth stone from the water's edge, turning it over in his hands. "Had a woman here 2 years ago, Catherine Whitmore from over near Pueblo. Married to a banker baron for 12 years. Came up here desperate for a child, convinced she was incomplete without one. What happened to her? Spent 3 weeks in this valley. By the end, she realized she'd never actually wanted children. She wanted her husband to stop treating her like a failure. Wanted her community to see her as valuable. I wanted to feel like her life had meaning." Dakota skipped the stone across the pool, watching the ripples spread outward. "She went home and told her husband she was leaving. Last I heard, she'd moved to San Francisco and was teaching school to immigrant children." The story resonated through Cynthia like a struck bell. "And her husband?" "Remarried within 6 months. Found himself a 19-year-old girl who gave him 3 children in 4 years. Catherine sent me a letter last Christmas, said she'd never been happier. Said she finally understood the difference between what you want and what other people want for you." They rode back to the cabin in thoughtful silence, taking a different route that led them past a hidden waterfall where rainbow trout flashed silver in the deep pools. The horses moved with sure-footed confidence along trails that would have terrified Cynthia yesterday. But today, she found herself trusting in their knowledge of the terrain. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun paint the sky in shades of rose and gold, Cynthia found herself voicing the question that had been building all day. If I stayed here longer, really stayed, not just a few days, what would that look like? Dakota didn't seem surprised by the question. "Depends on what you're trying to accomplish. If you're hoping I'll work some kind of magic that sends you home pregnant, you'll be disappointed. But if you're trying to figure out who you are when nobody's watching, when nobody's expecting anything from you, this is a good place for that kind of work." "And Thomas, my life in Cedar Falls? That's not for me to answer. But I will say this. You can't make real decisions about your future until you know what you actually want, not what you think you should want." He was quiet for a moment, listening to the evening sounds of the valley. "How long since you've made a choice just for yourself? Not for your husband, not for your community, not to meet someone else's expectations, just because it was what you truly desired?" The question hit Cynthia like a physical blow. She searched her memory, going back through years of careful decisions designed to please others, to fit in, to avoid criticism. When had she last done something simply because it brought her joy? "I can't remember," she whispered. "Then maybe that's where you start. Maybe you spend some time figuring out what Cynthia Morrison actually wants, underneath all the layers of what everyone else thinks she should want." That night, Cynthia lay awake, listening to the sounds of the mountain darkness. Somewhere in the distance, coyotes sang their wild songs to the stars. An owl called from the ancient pine outside her window. And underneath it all, she could hear the soft movements of the horses in the meadow below, living their untamed lives according to instincts older than civilization. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to imagine a different kind of existence. What would it be like to wake each morning to beauty instead of obligation? To spend her days doing work that fed her soul instead of simply fulfilling expectations? To be valued for who she was rather than what she could produce? The thoughts felt dangerous, revolutionary. In Cedar Falls, a woman's worth was measured by her husband's success and her children's accomplishments. But here in this hidden valley, surrounded by creatures who lived entirely according to their own nature, those measurements seemed not just arbitrary, but cruel. The next morning brought a surprise visitor. Cynthia was helping Dakota tend to a mare with a cut on her leg when they heard the sound of hoofbeats on the trail above. A woman emerged from the trees, riding a paint horse, with the confident ease of someone born to the saddle. She was perhaps 40 years old, with steel-grey hair braided down her back and eyes the color of mountain sage. Her clothes were practical: leather skirt, cotton blouse, boots that had seen hard use, but there was something regal about her bearing that spoke of inner authority rather than social position. "Esperanza," Dakota said, his face lighting up with genuine pleasure. "Didn't expect to see you until the autumn gathering." The woman dismounted with fluid grace, accepting Dakota's embrace with the easy affection of old friends. "Had to come down for supplies in Millbrook. Heard you had a visitor." Her gaze found Cynthia, assessing but not unkind. "Thought I might stop by and see how she was settling in. Cynthia Morrison, meet Esperanza Valdez. She runs a ranch about 10 miles north of here, breeds horses and raises cattle with her 3 daughters." Esperanza extended a work-hardened hand to Cynthia. "Pleasure to meet you. Dakota tells me you're from down in the flatlands." "Cedar Falls," Cynthia confirmed, suddenly conscious of how soft her own hands must feel in comparison to this woman's calloused grip. "Ah, heard of it. Pretty little town. Very proper." There was a hint of amusement in Esperanza's voice that suggested she knew exactly what kind of life Cynthia had left behind. As the 3 of them shared coffee and fresh-baked bread, Cynthia found herself drawn into conversation with a woman unlike any she'd ever met. Esperanza spoke casually of running cattle drives, breaking wild horses, and managing a ranch that covered thousands of acres of mountain territory. She'd raised 3 daughters alone after her husband died in a mining accident, turning them into capable horsewomen who could hold their own in any company. "People down in the towns," Esperanza said, gesturing toward the valleys below, "they think women are delicate flowers that need protecting. Up here we know different things. We know women are like the mountains themselves, strong enough to weather any storm, given the chance to stand on their own ground." After Esperanza left, promising to return before Cynthia departed, Dakota seemed thoughtful. "She's lived up here for 15 years, he said. "Came originally as someone's wife, stayed as her own woman. Her daughters have never known a world where they couldn't do anything they set their minds to. That evening, as they watched the horses move through their twilight routines, Cynthia found herself imagining what it would be like to be Esperanza's daughter, to grow up believing in her own strength, her own capabilities, her own right to determine the shape of her life. Is it possible, she asked suddenly, to change this late? To become someone completely different? Dakota considered the question carefully. Not completely different, but maybe you can become who you were always meant to be, underneath all the things other people tried to make you into. He pointed toward the paint mare that had approached them the first night. She was born wild, captured as a filly, spent 5 years in corrals and pastures, being told what to do and where to go. When she finally escaped and made it up here, it took months for her to remember how to be a horse again. But the wildness was still there, just buried under layers of training. The metaphor wasn't lost on Cynthia. As she watched the paint mare graze in the gathering darkness, moving with the fluid grace of an animal that had reclaimed its true nature, she wondered what kind of woman might emerge if she could strip away all the layers of conditioning that had shaped her life. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. But for the first time since arriving in this hidden valley, Cynthia began to believe that transformation might actually be possible. 2 weeks had passed since Cynthia's arrival in the hidden valley. 2 weeks that felt both like a lifetime and the blink of an eye. She'd settled into rhythms she'd never known existed, rising with the sun to help Dakota tend the horses, spending afternoons exploring mountain trails that led to secret places of breathtaking beauty, and evenings sitting by the fire as he shared stories of the land and its creatures. Her hands, once soft and carefully maintained, now bore the honest calluses of meaningful work. Her face had been kissed by mountain sun until it glowed with health she'd never possessed in Cedar Falls. Most importantly, the constant tension that had lived between her shoulder blades for 3 years had finally begun to ease. But today, a familiar sound echoed up from the valley floor, the rattle of wagon wheels on stone, the creak of leather harness, the voice of Billy Peterson calling out a greeting. Her time in this sanctuary was coming to an end, whether she was ready or not. Dakota emerged from the barn where he'd been treating a stallion's injured hoof, his expression carefully neutral. "Sounds like your ride back to civilization has arrived." Cynthia felt her stomach clench with something that might have been panic. "Already? It feels like I just got here. Time moves differently up here." "Always has." Dakota wiped his hands on a cloth, his movements deliberately slow. "The question is, are you ready to go back?" The simple question contained multitudes. Was she ready to return to Thomas and his expectations? To Martha Fairweather's Tuesday gatherings and their whispered judgments? To a life measured in failures and shortcomings rather than sunrises and wild horses? "I don't know," she admitted. Billy appeared at the top of the trail, leading his horse and looking travel-weary but relieved. Behind him walked a figure that made Cynthia's heart sink, Dr. Marcus Thornfield from Cedar Falls, his medical bag clutched in one hand and his face set in lines of professional concern. "Mrs. Morrison," Dr. Thornfield called out as he approached. "Your husband was quite worried when you didn't return as scheduled. He asked me to accompany young Peterson to ensure you were, well, the implication was clear. Thomas had sent the doctor to examine her, to determine whether her extended stay in the mountains had accomplished its purpose. The thought made her feel sick." "Dr. Thornfield," she managed, forcing politeness into her voice. "I wasn't expecting you." "Yes, well, when a woman disappears into the wilderness for 2 weeks with no word," the doctor's gaze swept over her appearance, taking in her sun-darkened skin, her practical clothes, the confident way she stood. "You look different." "Different how?" Dakota's voice carried a note of warning that made both visitors glance at him nervously. Dr. Thornfield cleared his throat. "Healthier, certainly. The mountain air has been beneficial." He set down his bag and opened it with officious efficiency. "If I might examine you, Mrs. Morrison? Your husband is naturally anxious to know whether your treatment has been successful." Heat flooded Cynthia's cheeks, partly from embarrassment but mostly from anger. The assumption that she would submit to such an examination, here in this place that had become sacred to her, felt like a violation of everything she'd discovered about herself. "That won't be necessary," she said firmly. Dr. Thornfield blinked in surprise. "I beg your pardon." "I said that won't be necessary. I'm perfectly capable of determining my own condition, thank you." Billy Peterson shifted uncomfortably, clearly wishing he were anywhere else. "Mrs. Morrison, your husband did ask that we bring you back as soon as possible. He's been concerned, not worried about her well-being, not missing her company, but concerned about the success of his scheme." The distinction cut deeper than she'd expected. "Give me a moment," Cynthia said. "I need to gather my things." But instead of going to the cabin, she found herself walking toward the meadow where the horses grazed. The paint mare she'd grown particularly fond of lifted her head as Cynthia approached, ears pricked forward with interest. Cynthia reached out to stroke the mare's neck, feeling the warm strength beneath her fingers, thinking about staying. Dakota's voice came from behind her, soft enough that the visitors couldn't hear. "Thinking about what that would mean," Cynthia replied, without turning around. "About what I'd be giving up and what I'd be gaining, and—" She was quiet for a long moment, watching the foal she'd seen on her first morning gambol through the grass with boundless energy. The sight that had once stirred longing now filled her with something else entirely. Joy in the creature's freedom, appreciation for its wildness, understanding that some things were beautiful precisely because they couldn't be owned or controlled. 3 weeks ago, I would have done anything to have a child, she said slowly. I would have sacrificed my dignity, my marriage, my sense of self, anything to fill that emptiness inside me. But now I'm not sure the emptiness was about children at all. Maybe it was about the life I wasn't living, the woman I wasn't allowed to be. She turned to face him, her decision crystallizing as she spoke. Dakota, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest. Always am. In these 2 weeks, have you seen any evidence that I'm with child? Dakota studied her face carefully. No, and I would know. I've been around enough pregnant mares to recognize the signs. Cynthia nodded, surprised by the relief she felt rather than disappointment. Then the stories about you, about what happens to women who come here. The stories are true, just not in the way people think. Women do leave here changed. They do often find themselves able to conceive after years of trying. But not because of anything I do to them. Dakota's voice was gentle but clear. They change because they finally give themselves permission to live according to their own nature, instead of someone else's expectations. That kind of transformation, letting go of stress and shame and pretense, that's what heals bodies that have forgotten how to create life. And the women who do conceive? They go home to husbands who suddenly see them as valuable again, who treat them with respect and attention instead of disappointment. They stop carrying the weight of everyone's judgment. They start believing they deserve good things. Dakota shrugged. Turns out that's a pretty powerful medicine. From the cabin, Dr. Thornfield's voice called out impatiently. Mrs. Morrison, we really should be going if we want to have a good time. Cynthia looked toward the sound, then back at the horses, then at Dakota. What if I don't go? Then you don't go. It's your choice. Thomas will never forgive me. The scandal will destroy both our reputations, probably. Is that more important than your happiness? The question hung in the air between them like smoke from a campfire. From her previous life, the answer would have been obvious. Of course, reputation mattered more than personal happiness. Women who prioritized their own desires over social expectations were selfish, immoral, destined for ruin. But standing here in this valley, where wild horses ran free and women like Esperanza raised daughters to believe in their own strength, those old certainties seemed as fragile as spiderwebs. Mrs. Morrison. Dr. Thornfield's voice carried a note of irritation now. Your husband is expecting you home by tomorrow evening. Then perhaps, Cynthia said quietly, it's time my husband learned to manage his expectations. The walk back to the cabin felt like a journey between worlds. With each step, she could feel the weight of her old life trying to settle back onto her shoulders, the obligations, the judgments, the careful measurement of worth according to other people's standards. But underneath that familiar burden, something new had taken root, something that felt remarkably like strength. Billy Peterson looked relieved when she appeared, but Dr. Thornfield's expression was increasingly troubled. Mrs. Morrison, I hope you understand the position your prolonged absence has put your husband in. There are already whispers in town, questions about your activities. Up here, what kind of questions? Cynthia's voice was deceptively calm. Whether your time here has been appropriate for a married woman. The doctor's face flushed with embarrassment, but he pressed on. Mr. Morrison has been forced to defend your honor more than once. Dakota stepped up beside Cynthia, his presence solid and reassuring. And what exactly has he been defending it against? Dr. Thornfield straightened his shoulders, trying to project authority in the face of the cowboy's quiet intimidation. Speculation about the nature of your treatment methods, Mr. Reed. There are those who question whether a married woman should be alone with an unmarried man for such an extended period. I see. Dakota's voice was dangerously soft. And what does a good doctor think about married women who make their own decisions about their medical care? I think, Dr. Thornfield replied stiffly, that married women have obligations to their husbands and their communities that supersede their personal preferences. The words crystallized something in Cynthia's mind with perfect clarity. Here, laid out in stark terms, was the choice she faced: continue to live as property, as an extension of Thomas's will and society's expectations, or claim the right to make her own decisions about her own life. Dr. Thornfield, she said, her voice carrying a new note of authority that surprised everyone, including herself. Please give my husband this message. I will return to Cedar Falls when I'm ready to return, not before. If he wishes to defend my honor, he can start by respecting my autonomy. Mrs. Morrison, I hardly think, and furthermore, Cynthia continued, the words flowing with gathering momentum. You can tell him that if he's so concerned about gossip, perhaps he should consider that sending his wife to another man for treatment might have been what started the whispers. In the first place, Billy Peterson's eyes widened. Dr. Thornfield's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. But Dakota's expression showed something that might have been pride. I'll need another week, Cynthia said firmly. Perhaps two. When I'm ready to leave, I'll send word down to Millbrook. Mrs. Morrison, your husband specifically instructed. My husband, Cynthia interrupted, sent me here to solve a problem. The problem is being solved, just not in the way he expected. She looked directly at Dr. Thornfield, her gaze steady and unflinching. I suggest you return to Cedar Falls and inform him that his wife is perfectly safe and will return when her business here is complete. After the two men reluctantly departed, leading their horses back down the treacherous trail towards civilization, Cynthia found herself alone with Dakota on the porch. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of fire that seemed to celebrate her newfound courage. Feel good? Dakota asked. Terrifying, Cynthia admitted. But yes, it feels good. It feels like the first real choice I've made in years. Second choice, he corrected gently. Second? The first was deciding to stay when they came to take you back. This was just announcing that decision to the world. That night, as Cynthia lay in her simple bed, listening to the mountain wind sing through the pines, she thought about the woman who had arrived in this valley 2 weeks ago. That woman had been desperate, broken, willing to sacrifice anything for the chance to finally meet everyone else's expectations. She'd been so focused on her failures that she'd forgotten to consider what success might actually look like. But the woman lying here now understood something profound. True success meant living according to your own values, your own dreams, your own definition of a life well lived. It meant choosing authenticity over approval, self-respect over social acceptance. The horses in the meadow below moved restlessly in the darkness, their wild hearts calling them toward adventures only they could understand. And for the first time in her adult life, Cynthia Morrison felt the stirring of that same wild heart within herself. Not broken, not barren, but simply waiting for permission to run free. Outside her window, a coyote sang to the stars, its voice carrying across the valley like a hymn to untamed possibilities. Cynthia smiled in the darkness, understanding at last that some songs could only be sung by creatures who had learned to trust their own wild nature. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new choices, new opportunities to define herself on her own terms. But tonight, she was exactly where she belonged, in a place where wildness was valued over tameness, where authenticity mattered more than appearance, where a woman could discover who she truly was beneath all the layers of who she'd been told to be. The transformation was complete. Now came the real test, carrying that transformation back into a world that would resist it with every fiber of its conventional being. 3 weeks later, on a crisp autumn morning, when the aspen leaves had turned to gold and the air carried the promise of early snow, Cynthia Morrison prepared to leave the mountain sanctuary that had become more home to her than any place she'd ever lived. But the woman who packed her traveling bag bore little resemblance to the desperate wife who had arrived a month ago. Her movements were deliberate, confident, unhurried. She folded her traveling dress, the same blue fabric that had once seemed so important, and placed it carefully in the bottom of her bag. Over it went the practical clothes she'd acquired during her stay, leather skirts that could withstand mountain trails, cotton blouses that breathed with honest work, boots that had carried her across landscapes of impossible beauty. Dakota watched from the doorway, his expression unreadable. "Are you sure about this?" Cynthia paused in her packing, considering the question she'd been asking herself for days. No, but I'm sure about who I am now, and that woman needs to go back and face what she left behind. Could stay, he offered quietly. Esperanza's always looking for help with the horses. There's good land for sale in the next valley over. Might be room for another independent woman up here. The temptation was real and powerful. She'd seen how Esperanza lived, how her daughters moved through the world with the easy confidence of women who'd never been told their dreams were too big or their ambitions inappropriate. It would be simple to disappear into this mountain country, to let Cynthia Morrison of Cedar Falls fade into memory while someone new and wild took her place. But running away felt too much like the old Cynthia, the woman who avoided difficult conversations, who chose safety over authenticity, who let others make the important decisions about her life. I need to finish what I started, she said finally. I need to tell Thomas the truth about what I discovered up here. And I need to show the women of Cedar Falls that there are other ways to be. Dakota nodded slowly. And if they don't want to hear it, then at least I'll know I tried. At least I'll know I chose courage over comfort. The ride down the mountain was bittersweet, each familiar landmark marking another step away from the freedom she'd found in the high country. But as they descended through changing zones of vegetation, from alpine meadows to pine forests to the scrub oak and sage of the lower elevations, Cynthia felt something unexpected. Excitement. For the first time in her adult life, she was returning home not as someone seeking approval, but as someone offering a gift. The gift of truth, of possibility, of proof that women could be more than what their small world expected. Dakota rode beside her in comfortable silence, leading a pack horse loaded with supplies and something else, a wooden cradle he'd carved during the long evenings of her stay. The craftsmanship was exquisite, every curve and joint speaking of patience and skill. But it wasn't a cradle for the child she'd once desperately wanted. It was something far more valuable, a symbol of the new life she was choosing to create. They stopped for lunch beside the same natural pool where she'd drunk from the ancient spring on her first day in Dakota's valley. The water still tasted of snow and stone and timeless purity, but now it seemed like a blessing rather than just refreshment. "What will you tell them?" Dakota asked as they shared bread and cheese in the dappled sunlight. "The truth. I went looking for a child and found myself instead. That sometimes the thing you think you want isn't what you actually need." Cynthia dipped her hand in the clear water, watching the ripples spread outward. "That there are different ways to be a woman, different ways to find meaning and purpose. And your husband." Cynthia was quiet for a long moment, thinking about Thomas and the careful, distant life they'd built together. "Thomas is a good man, but he's not my man. Not anymore. Maybe he never was. We married because it was expected. Stayed married because it was easier than admitting we were wrong for each other. That's going to be a hard conversation, yes, but not as hard as spending the rest of my life pretending to be someone I'm not." As they approached Millbrook in the late afternoon, Cynthia felt her pulse quicken. Word of their approach had preceded them. She could see faces in windows, people emerging from shops to watch the woman who had disappeared into the mountains return with the mysterious cowboy beside her. But instead of the shame she might have expected, Cynthia felt a surge of pride. Let them look. Let them wonder. Let them see that she'd survived her journey to the wild places and emerged stronger for it. Billy Peterson was waiting at the livery stable, his young face creased with worry that transformed into relief when he saw her. "Mrs. Morrison, thank the Lord you're safe. Your husband's been beside himself with worry, has he?" Cynthia's voice carried a note of skepticism that made Billy glance at her uncertainly. "Oh, yes, ma'am. Been to the sheriff twice, talking about organizing a search party. Dr. Thornfield told him you were well, but—" Billy trailed off, clearly uncomfortable with the delicate nature of the situation. But he didn't believe that a woman could make her own decisions about her own life. Cynthia finished calmly. Dakota helped her down from her horse, his hands strong and steady. For a moment their eyes met, and she saw understanding there, support, and something that might have been love, not the possessive kind that demanded ownership, but the generous kind that wanted only her happiness. "You'll be all right?" he asked quietly. "I'll be all right," she confirmed. "And if I'm not, I know where to find you." He smiled then, the warm expression that transformed his weathered face. "You know where to find yourself now. That's more important." The wagon ride back to Cedar Falls felt like traveling through a foreign country. The familiar landscape looked smaller somehow. The farmhouses and fenced fields, speaking of lives lived within careful boundaries. As they approached the town limits, Cynthia could see people emerging from their homes to watch her return. Martha Fairweather on her front porch, neighbors gathering in clusters, faces filled with curiosity and judgment. But instead of shrinking under their scrutiny as she once would have, Cynthia sat straighter, meeting their gazes with calm confidence. She had nothing to hide, nothing to be ashamed of. She had gone into the mountains as one woman and returned as another, and that transformation was worthy of pride, not shame. Thomas was waiting on the front porch of their house, his face a mixture of relief, anger, and something that might have been fear. He looked older than when she'd left, the lines around his eyes deeper, his usually precise appearance slightly disheveled. "Cynthia," he said, as Billy helped her down from the wagon. "Thank God you're home safe, Thomas." Her voice was polite but distant, as if she were greeting an acquaintance rather than her husband. He stepped forward as if to embrace her, then seemed to think better of it. That is, did you spend your time in the mountains? Was it successful?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with all his hopes and expectations. Cynthia looked at this man she'd once thought she loved, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time. He wasn't a bad man, but he was a limited one, someone who measured success in conventional terms, who couldn't imagine that his wife might want something beyond his narrow definition of fulfillment. "Yes," she said finally. "It was very successful, just not in the way you expected." Thomas's face brightened with premature relief. "Then we're going to have—" "No." The word cut through his excitement like a blade. "I'm not with child, Thomas. And I'm not going to be." His expression crumpled, hope transforming into bitter disappointment. "Then what was the point? What have you been doing up there all this time?" "Learning who I really am. Discovering what I actually want from life. Realizing that I don't need to fix myself to meet other people's expectations." Cynthia's voice grew stronger with each word. "I went looking for a baby and found something much more valuable. I found myself." "Yourself." Thomas's voice rose with incredulity. "What good is that? What about our family line? What about children carrying on the Morrison name? What about my happiness, Thomas? What about my dreams, my desires, my right to determine the shape of my own life?" The question seemed to genuinely confuse him. "But you're my wife. Your happiness is. That is, it should come from fulfilling your duties as my wife." Around them, Cynthia could see neighbors gathering at a respectful distance, drawn by the raised voices. Martha Fairweather stood at her garden gate, her face alight with malicious interest. The butcher's wife had emerged from her shop, wiping her hands on her apron. Even Reverend Hayes had appeared at the corner, his expression troubled. Perfect. Let them all hear this. Let them all understand that change was possible, that women could choose their own paths. "My duties," Cynthia repeated, her voice carrying clearly in the still air. "Tell me, Thomas, what exactly are those duties? To produce children, whether I want them or not. To pretend contentment with a life that stifles my spirit. To smile and nod while people judge me for failing to meet expectations I never agreed to." "Cynthia, please," Thomas said, glancing nervously at their audience. "This isn't the place for such a discussion. This is exactly the place. These people have been talking about me for 3 years, speculating about my failures, whispering about my inadequacies. They deserve to hear the truth." She turned to face the gathering crowd, her voice clear and strong. "I spent a month in the mountains with Dakota Reed, not seeking some magical cure for barrenness, but learning to see myself as something other than a failed baby-making machine. I learned that a woman's worth isn't measured by her ability to produce children. I learned that happiness comes from living authentically, not from meeting other people's expectations. Martha Fairweather stepped forward, her face tight with disapproval. And what of your Christian duty? What is the sanctity of marriage? What of it? Cynthia met the older woman's glare without flinching. Is it Christian to force a woman into a role that destroys her spirit? Is it sacred to maintain a marriage built on deception and disappointment? You speak of deception. Dr. Thornfield's voice cut through the murmur of the crowd. He had emerged from his office, medical bag in hand, his face set in lines of professional authority. What of the deception of abandoning your husband for weeks to consort with a man of questionable reputation? Questionable according to whom? Cynthia's voice carried a dangerous edge. According to people who've never met him, never seen how he lives, never witnessed the respect he shows to every living creature in his care. Dakota Reed is a better man than any I've known in this town. He sees women as complete human beings rather than failed versions of what he thinks they should be. The crowd stirred uneasily at this direct challenge to their moral certainty. But Cynthia wasn't finished. I did not go to the mountains to betray my marriage vows. I went to save myself from suffocating under the weight of your judgments. And I succeeded. I am no longer the desperate, broken woman who left here a month ago. I am someone who knows her own mind, her own worth, her own power to choose her own path. Thomas stepped closer, his face flushed with embarrassment and anger. And what of me? What of our marriage? Do I have no say in this transformation of yours? You had your say 3 years ago when you decided I was defective. You had your say when you sent me to another man to be fixed. You had your say when you measured my worth solely by my ability to produce children. Cynthia's voice was steady, implacable. Now it's my turn to speak. She reached into her traveling bag and withdrew the wooden cradle Dakota had carved, holding it up for all to see. The crowd murmured, confused by this apparent contradiction of her claims. This is a cradle, she announced, made by a man who understands what creation really means. Not the desperate grasping for conventional success, but the patient crafting of something beautiful and meaningful. Dakota Reed taught me that there are many ways to nurture life, many ways to leave a legacy. She set the cradle on the porch steps, its polished wood gleaming in the afternoon sunlight. I don't need to bear children to be complete. I don't need to fulfill your expectations to have value. I don't need to pretend contentment with a life that diminishes me. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the sound of wind through the oak trees that lined the street. Cynthia looked at the faces surrounding her, some shocked, some angry, some thoughtful, and a few that showed something that might have been admiration. Thomas, she said finally, turning back to her husband, I'm grateful for the years we've had together, but I can't pretend anymore that we want the same things from life. You deserve a wife who shares your dreams, and I deserve the chance to discover what my dreams actually are. Thomas's face had gone pale, but his voice was steady when he spoke. Are you leaving me? I'm leaving the life we built together, yes. It doesn't fit who I've become. Cynthia's voice was gentle now, almost kind. You can choose to grow with me, to build something new and honest between us. Or you can hold on to the old expectations and let me go. But I won't go back to being the woman I was before. As the crowd slowly dispersed, buzzing with shock and speculation, Cynthia picked up her traveling bag and the wooden cradle. She had returned to Cedar Falls, but she had not come home. Home was something she would have to create for herself. Whether in this place or somewhere else entirely, the real test was just beginning. 6 months had passed since Cynthia's return to Cedar Falls. 6 months that had transformed the town as surely as they had transformed her. The woman who had once sat silent in Martha Fairweather's parlor now ran her own establishment, a boarding house for women traveling alone, a sanctuary where female teachers, nurses, and even the occasional female entrepreneur could find respectable lodging without the suspicious glances that followed unaccompanied women elsewhere. The Morrison house had been sold. Thomas, after 3 weeks of stubborn silence, followed by 2 months of heated arguments, had finally accepted that his wife would not return to being the compliant woman he'd married. He'd taken a position with a bank in Denver, leaving behind both the hardware store and the life they'd built together. The divorce papers were filed quietly, handled with as much discretion as such scandalous business could manage in a town the size of Cedar Falls. But Cynthia had not left. To everyone's surprise, including her own, she had chosen to stay and fight for the right to live authentically in the place that had nearly destroyed her. Using her share of the proceeds from the house sale and a small inheritance from her grandmother that she'd never before been allowed to touch, she'd purchased the old Hendrick place on the edge of town, a sprawling Victorian house with enough rooms to accommodate a dozen guests and enough land for the project that had become her passion. The horses arrived on a crisp April morning when the cottonwoods were just beginning to bud and the meadowlarks had returned to sing from fence posts. Cynthia stood in her front yard, watching Dakota Reed guide 6 mares and 2 geldings down Main Street as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Behind him rode Esperanza Valdez and her eldest daughter Carmen, both sitting their saddles with the easy grace of women born to horseback. The procession drew every eye in town. Children ran alongside the horses, their faces bright with wonder. Men emerged from shops and offices to stare at the magnificent animals that moved like liquid music down the dusty street. And the women watched with something that might have been longing, as if they sensed that these creatures represented a kind of freedom they'd forgotten existed. Martha Fairweather stood on her porch, her mouth pressed into a thin line of disapproval. "Bringing wild animals into a civilized town," she declared loudly enough for half the street to hear. "Mark my words, no good will come of this nonsense." But her words carried less weight than they once had. In the months since Cynthia's public declaration of independence, other women had begun to speak up, to question, to choose paths that deviated from the narrow expectations of their community. Sarah Jenkins had left her abusive husband and opened a seamstress shop. Mary Catherine Walsh had refused her father's choice of husband and announced her intention to become a teacher. Even young Lucy Henderson had cut her hair short and taken to wearing practical skirts that allowed her to ride astride rather than side saddle. The changes were small, incremental, but they were spreading like ripples from a stone thrown into still water. And at the center of it all stood Cynthia Morrison. No longer Morrison. She'd legally reclaimed her maiden name of Foster, calm and confident in her own choices, offering living proof that women could survive and thrive outside the prescribed boundaries of their roles. Dakota dismounted in front of her house, his storm-gray eyes finding hers with the warm familiarity of deep friendship. "Delivery as promised," he said with a smile that made her heart skip. 8 of the gentlest horses in the territory, hand-picked for ladies who've never been properly introduced to the art of real riding. Cynthia walked among the horses, greeting each one with the confidence she'd learned in the high country. They were beautiful animals, a bay mare with eyes like dark honey, a grey gelding with the patience of a saint, a spirited chestnut that would challenge the more adventurous riders without overwhelming them. But more than their physical beauty, they carried something else, the wild spirit that had called to her own untamed heart in Dakota's valley. "They're perfect," she said, running her hand along the neck of a paint mare that reminded her of the horse that had first touched her soul in the mountains. "Absolutely perfect. Wait until you see what they can do for the women who ride them," Esperanza said, swinging down from her horse with fluid grace. Carmen here was shy as a church mouse until she learned to sit on a horse properly. Now look at her. Carmen Valdez was indeed transformed from the quiet girl Cynthia remembered from her mountain stay. At 19, she possessed the kind of confidence that came from knowing she could handle anything life threw at her. Whether it was a fractious horse, a difficult cattle drive, or the condescending assumptions of men who thought women belonged only in kitchens and parlors. "Miss Foster," Carmen said with a slight accent that spoke of her Mexican heritage. My mother says you plan to teach the town ladies to ride like we do in the mountains. Will they listen? Cynthia glanced toward the small crowd that had gathered to watch the proceedings. Among the curious faces, she spotted several that belonged to women she'd spoken with privately over the past months, women who had confessed their own longings for something more than the circumscribed lives they'd been offered. Some will, she said confidently, and those who do will never be quite the same afterward. The riding school opened officially the following Monday. Cynthia had prepared carefully, creating a proper ring behind her house where beginners could learn safely, establishing rules that prioritized both horse welfare and rider confidence, and most importantly, setting the tone that this was a place where women could discover their own capabilities without judgment or limitation. Her first student was Margaret Clearwater, a widow in her 40s whose husband had left her with a small farm and the assumption that she should sell it and move in with relatives. Margaret had other ideas. I want to learn to ride well enough to manage my own cattle, she announced on that first morning, her graying hair pinned back severely and her expression determined. I'm tired of depending on hired men who think a woman can't tell the difference between a good bull and poor breeding stock. By the end of her first lesson, Margaret was sitting her horse with the kind of natural seat that spoke of suppressed instincts, finally allowed expression. The transformation was remarkable, shoulders back, chin up, eyes bright with the confidence that came from mastering something she'd been told was beyond her capabilities. I feel like I could ride to California, she breathed as Dakota helped her. Dismount after an hour of basic instruction. You probably could, he replied seriously. The question is whether you want to. Word of the riding school spread with the speed that only shocking news could achieve in a small town. Some women came openly, declaring their intention to learn a practical skill. Others arrived with elaborate excuses. They needed to be able to handle a horse in case of emergency, or their physician had recommended exercise, or they wanted to better understand their husband's interests. But underneath the surface justifications, Cynthia recognized the same hunger she'd carried for years, the longing to touch something wild, to prove to themselves that they were capable of more than their limited world allowed, to feel the kind of freedom that could only come from trusting a powerful animal to carry them beyond the boundaries of their everyday existence. Among her students was Rebecca Walsh, the banker's wife who had never spoken above a whisper in any social gathering. After 3 weeks of lessons, she surprised everyone by announcing that she intended to ride her horse to the county seat to conduct business at the land office, alone, without her husband's escort, wearing the practical riding clothes that allowed her to sit, astride rather than perched precariously on a side saddle. My husband says it's unseemly, she confided to Cynthia after a particularly successful lesson. He says people will talk. People are already talking, Cynthia replied calmly. The question is whether you're going to live your life according to their expectations or your own needs. Rebecca considered this, stroking the neck of the gentle mare that had become her favorite mount. When I'm on horseback, I feel like myself for the first time in 20 years of marriage. Is that wrong? Only if you think being yourself is wrong. Rebecca made the trip to the county seat the following week, returning with the deed to a small parcel of land she'd purchased in her own name, and a confidence that transformed her bearing permanently. Her husband adjusted to the change with surprising grace, perhaps recognizing that a happy wife was worth more than a completely compliant one. But it was the arrival of young Emma Patterson that truly tested Cynthia's commitment to her principles. Emma was barely 17, the daughter of the town's most prominent minister, and she arrived at the riding school in defiance of her father's explicit prohibition. He says riding astride is immodest, Emma explained, her young face set in lines of stubborn determination. He says ladies should confine their activities to pursuits that enhance their feminine virtues. But I've watched you and the other women, Miss Foster, and I've never seen anything more beautiful than the way you sit on a horse. I want to learn to be strong like that." Teaching Emma required delicate navigation. Her father, Reverend Patterson, held significant influence in Cedar Falls, and his disapproval could potentially shut down the riding school entirely. But the girl's hunger for authentic experience was so palpable that Cynthia couldn't bring herself to turn her away. "We'll start with basic horsemanship," she told Emma carefully. "You'll learn to care for the animals, to understand their needs and behaviors. If your father objects to the riding itself, perhaps he'll be more comfortable with you developing skills in animal husbandry." It was a compromise that satisfied no one completely, but allowed Emma to begin her transformation. Within a month, the shy minister's daughter had become one of Cynthia's most dedicated students, arriving early to help with feeding and grooming, staying late to practice the subtle communications that allowed horse and rider to move as one entity. The crisis came in late summer, when Reverend Patterson arrived at the riding school, unannounced, to find his daughter cantering around the ring with the easy grace of a natural horsewoman. His face went pale with rage, and his voice shook as he ordered Emma to dismount immediately. "This ends now," he declared, his gaze fixed on Cynthia with the kind of righteous fury that had launched religious wars. "I will not have my daughter corrupted by your influence, Miss Foster. Emma will not be returning to this establishment." But Emma surprised everyone, perhaps including herself, by remaining in her saddle, her hands steady on the reins, her young face set with quiet determination. "No, Father," she said clearly. "I won't stop coming here. For the first time in my life, I feel like myself. I feel strong and capable and worthy of respect. If you force me to give that up, you'll be destroying something precious that God gave me." The standoff lasted for several tense minutes, father and daughter locked in a battle of wills that would determine not just Emma's immediate future, but the trajectory of her entire life. Around them, other students had gathered, their faces showing a mixture of support and anxiety. Finally, it was Reverend Patterson who broke. Perhaps he saw something in his daughter's face that reminded him of the spirited woman he'd married 20 years earlier. Perhaps he recognized that trying to break Emma's newfound confidence would damage their relationship beyond repair. Or perhaps he simply understood that some battles couldn't be won through force. 2 hours a week, he said finally, his voice tight with reluctant compromise. "No more, and you will continue to comfort yourself as a lady in all other aspects of your life." Emma's smile was radiant. "Yes, Father. Thank you." As autumn approached and the cottonwoods began their transformation to gold, Cynthia found herself reflecting on the changes that had swept through Cedar Falls like wildfire. The riding school had become more than just a place to learn horsemanship. It had become a symbol of possibility, proof that women could claim space for their own growth and development without bringing civilization crashing down around them. But the most profound change had occurred in Cynthia herself. The desperate, broken woman who had fled to the mountains in search of a child had returned as someone entirely different, confident, purposeful, surrounded by meaningful work and genuine friendships. She had found her calling not in motherhood, but in mentoring other women to discover their own strength. On a crisp October evening, as she stood in her paddock watching her students practice their newfound skills, Dakota approached from the direction of town. He'd become a regular visitor, splitting his time between his mountain sanctuary and the civilized world that Cynthia was slowly helping to transform. "Looks like you've started something that can't be stopped," he observed, watching Margaret Clearwater guide her horse through a series of turns with the confidence of someone who'd found her calling. "Good," Cynthia replied firmly. It needed starting. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the women who had become her extended family pursue their own versions of freedom and authenticity. Some would go on to achieve things that had been unthinkable for women of their generation. Others would find smaller but equally meaningful ways to live according to their own values, rather than society's expectations. Any regrets? Dakota asked quietly. Cynthia considered the question seriously. She thought about the life she'd left behind, the conventional happiness she'd once thought she wanted, the children she'd never bear. Then she looked at the young women learning to trust their own strength, at the older women discovering capabilities they'd never known they possessed, at the community she'd helped create where authenticity mattered more than appearance. "Only one," she said finally. "What's that?" "That I waited so long to discover who I really was." As if summoned by her words, Emma Patterson rode up to the fence, her young face glowing with the kind of joy that comes from doing what you love. Behind her came Rebecca Walsh and Margaret Clearwater, chatting easily about their plans for the weekend ride they'd organized to explore the foothills. "Miss Foster," Emma called out, "Mrs. Clearwater wants to know if you think we're ready to try some of those mountain trails you've told us about." Cynthia looked at these women who had become her closest friends, her partners in the quiet revolution they were staging against the limitations of their world. They were ready for bigger adventures, broader horizons, deeper challenges to their expanding sense of what was possible. "I think," she said with a smile that carried all the warmth of her transformed heart, "we're ready for anything." That night, alone in her house that had become a sanctuary for women seeking their own versions of freedom, Cynthia wrote a letter to her grandmother's memory, the woman whose small inheritance had made this new life possible. "Dear grandmother, you always told me that a woman's greatest gift was her ability to create life. I thought you meant children, and I spent years feeling broken because I couldn't give that gift to the world. But now I understand what you really meant. I have created life, not in my womb, but in the hearts and minds of women who had forgotten they were capable of more than they'd been told. I have birthed confidence where there was doubt, strength where there was submission, joy where there was resignation. This is my legacy, my contribution to the future. Women who will raise daughters to believe in their own power, who will refuse to accept limitations based on gender rather than ability, who will insist on the right to define their own worth. The child I never had lives in every woman I teach to sit a horse like she owns the world. Thank you for showing me that there are many ways to mother the future." As she sealed the letter, Cynthia heard the sound she'd come to love above all others, the soft nickering of horses settling in for the night, the whispered conversations of creatures who knew their own worth and refused to be diminished by anyone's expectations. Outside her window, the stars burned with the same wild light she'd first seen in Dakota's Valley, reminding her that some things were beautiful precisely because they couldn't be tamed, possessed, or forced into shapes that suited other people's comfort. Cynthia Morrison had gone to the mountains seeking a miracle, and she'd found one, not in the child she'd thought she wanted, but in the woman she'd never known she could become. The miracle of self-discovery, of authentic living, of the courage to choose your own path, even when the world insists you're wrong. And in the end, that was the greatest gift she could give to herself, and to every woman brave enough to follow her example into the wild territory of their own untapped potential. Winter arrived early that year, blanketing Cedar Falls in snow that seemed to muffle the whispers and judgments that had once filled every street corner. The riding school moved indoors to the large barns Cynthia had constructed behind her boarding house, where the scent of hay and leather mixed with the laughter of women discovering their own capabilities. But it was on a particularly bitter February morning that the most unexpected transformation occurred. Martha Fairweather appeared at Cynthia's door, her usual imperious bearing replaced by something that looked almost like humility. "Miss Foster," she said, her breath forming clouds in the cold air, "I wonder if I might speak with you privately." Cynthia invited her in, curious about what could have brought the town's most vocal critic to her doorstep. Martha sat stiffly in the parlor, her hands folded in her lap, struggling with words that seemed foreign to her tongue. "My granddaughter," she began finally, Young Helen from back east. She's coming to stay with me this spring. The girl has difficulties. Her parents say she's willful, disobedient. They've tried everything. Finishing schools, strict governesses, even a stint in a sanitarium for nervous disorders. Martha's voice cracked slightly. She's only 15, but they're talking about committing to her permanently if she doesn't learn to conform. Cynthia waited, sensing there was more to come. I've been watching your students, Martha continued, her admission clearly painful. The way they carry themselves now, the confidence they've gained. Even Emma Patterson, that girl, was scared of her own shadow 6 months ago, and now she speaks her mind in church meetings. She lifted her eyes to meet Cynthia's. I don't want Helen to end up in an asylum because she has spirit. The request that followed was unprecedented. Would Cynthia consider taking Helen as both a boarding house guest and a special student? Someone who needed more than riding lessons, someone who needed proof that strong-willed women could find their place in the world without being broken. Helen Fairweather arrived in March like a spring storm, all wild energy and barely contained rebellion. At 15, she possessed the kind of fierce intelligence that had terrified every adult charged with her care. She'd been expelled from 3 schools, dismissed by 4 governesses, and had once set fire to a neighbor's garden shed, rather than attend a tea party where she was expected to sit quietly while adults discussed her condition. They say I'm disturbed, she announced to Cynthia on her first day, her chin raised defiantly. They say I need to be medicated and restrained, but I think they're the ones who are sick, with the need to crush anything that doesn't fit their narrow ideas of what girls should. Cynthia saw immediately that Helen wasn't disturbed. She was drowning in a world that had no place for her particular brand of brilliance, no outlet for her volcanic energy, no appreciation for the sharp wit that could dissect hypocrisy with surgical precision. What do you want to do with your life? Cynthia asked during their first real conversation. Helen's eyes lit up with surprise. Clearly, no adult had ever asked her that question before. I want to study medicine. I want to discover new treatments, find cures for diseases. I want to save lives, her voice dropped. But they say women can't be doctors. They say the sight of blood would make us faint, that our delicate constitutions can't handle the rigors of medical training. They say a lot of things, Cynthia replied calmly. The question is whether you're going to let their limitations become yours. Working with Helen required every skill Cynthia had developed over the past year. The girl's energy was boundless but unfocused, her intelligence razor-sharp but wielded like a weapon against anyone who tried to direct it. But gradually, through patient conversation and the gentle discipline of working with horses, Helen began to channel her intensity into purpose. The breakthrough came when one of the boarding house horses developed a severe colic. Helen, who had been shadowing the local veterinarian despite her grandmother's horror, immediately recognized the symptoms and began assisting with the treatment. Her hands were steady, her mind clear, her natural empathy for suffering creatures overriding any squeamishness about blood or pain. She has the gift, Dr. Williams admitted privately to Cynthia after watching Helen work. I've seen grown men who couldn't handle what that girl did today. But medical school, they'll never accept her no matter how capable she is. Then maybe, Cynthia suggested, it's time to change their minds. That spring brought news that electrified the entire region. Dr. Emily Blackwell, sister of the famous Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell, was establishing a new medical college in Denver that would accept qualified female students. The announcement sent shockwaves through conservative communities across Colorado, but in Cedar Falls, it sparked something different, hope. Helen threw herself into preparation with the same fierce determination she'd once applied to rebellion. She studied anatomy texts borrowed from Dr. Williams, practiced surgical techniques on donated animal carcasses, and absorbed every piece of medical knowledge she could find. Her transformation was remarkable. The wild, angry girl became focused, purposeful, brilliant in ways that couldn't be ignored or dismissed. But perhaps the most significant change occurred in her grandmother. Martha Fairweather, who had spent decades enforcing rigid social conventions, found herself defending her granddaughter's ambitions with the ferocity of a lioness protecting her cub. "She's going to be a doctor," Martha announced at a church social, her voice carrying to every corner of the room. "And anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with me." The declaration sent ripples through Cedar Falls society that extended far beyond one family's dynamics. If Martha Fairweather, the ultimate arbiter of proper behavior, could embrace such radical change, what other transformations might be possible? The answer came in waves throughout that summer. Sarah Jenkins expanded her seamstress shop into a full dressmaking establishment that employed 6 women and served customers from 3 counties. Mary Catherine Walsh not only became a teacher, but began advocating for higher wages and better working conditions for female educators. Even quiet Lucy Henderson shocked everyone by announcing her engagement to a young man from Denver who supported her dreams of becoming a photographer. But the most powerful transformation occurred when Dr. Williams suffered a heart attack in late July, with the nearest replacement physician 2 days' travel away. Helen Fairweather stepped into the breach, working under the distant supervision of a doctor in Colorado Springs who guided her via telegraph. She delivered 2 babies, set a broken arm, and treated a serious case of pneumonia, all while maintaining the kind of calm competence that would have impressed seasoned medical professionals. That girl saved 3 lives this week. Reverend Patterson announced from his pulpit the following Sunday, his voice heavy with emotion. "She did God's work with skill and courage that humbled everyone who witnessed it. Anyone who still believes women are too delicate for serious responsibility hasn't been paying attention." The sermon marked a turning point not just for Helen, but for the entire community's understanding of what women could accomplish when given the opportunity. By autumn, when Helen departed for medical school in Denver, she carried with her not just her own dreams, but the hopes and pride of a town that had learned to see beyond its own limitations. Dakota had witnessed much of Helen's transformation. During his regular visits to Cedar Falls, and his presence had evolved from that of occasional guests to something approaching family. The relationship between him and Cynthia had deepened over the months, but it remained refreshingly free of the possessive dynamics that had characterized her marriage to Thomas. "You're building something remarkable here," he told her one evening as they watched Helen demonstrate surgical knots to a group of fascinated younger women. "This isn't just a riding school anymore. It's a revolution." Cynthia smiled, thinking of all the women whose lives had been touched by the simple recognition that they deserved to live authentically. Maybe that's what the world needs. Not grand gestures or dramatic upheavals, but quiet revolutions that happen one woman at a time. As winter approached again, Cynthia realized that her boarding house had become something unprecedented in their region, a place where women could come to reinvent themselves, to discover capabilities they'd never known they possessed, to dream bigger than their circumstances had previously allowed. Her guests included a widow learning to manage her late husband's ranch, a young woman fleeing an arranged marriage, and even a traveling author who was documenting the changing roles of women in the American West. The transformation wasn't limited to individuals. Cedar Falls itself had begun to change in ways both subtle and profound. Women's voices carried more weight in community decisions. Young girls grew up with expanded ideas about their possibilities. Even the men of the town, initially resistant to the changes, began to recognize the benefits of living alongside confident, capable women who contributed meaningfully to community life. On Christmas Eve, as snow fell softly outside the windows of her warm, bustling boarding house, Cynthia hosted a gathering unlike any Cedar Falls had ever seen. A parlor filled with women of all ages, from teenage Helen Home from medical school to 70-year-old Margaret Clearwater, who had recently been elected to the school board. They shared stories of their accomplishments, their struggles, their dreams for the future. "A year ago," Emma Patterson said, now 18 and preparing for teachers' college. I couldn't imagine speaking in front of more than 3 people. Tonight, I'm giving a speech at the New Year's Eve town meeting about the need for a public library. 2 years ago, Rebecca Walsh added, I had never made a decision more significant than what to serve for dinner. Last month, I bought a second property and opened a boarding house for businesswomen in the county seat. As the evening wore on and stories multiplied, Cynthia felt a profound sense of completion. The desperate woman who had fled to the mountains seeking a cure for her barrenness had indeed found healing, not in the form of biological motherhood, but in the deeper satisfaction of nurturing human potential. When the last guest had departed and the house settled into peaceful silence, Cynthia sat alone by her fireplace, holding the wooden cradle Dakota had carved 2 years earlier. She'd kept it all this time, not as a reminder of what she lacked, but as a symbol of what she'd found, the understanding that creation takes many forms, that legacy can be built through the lives you touch rather than the children you bear. Outside, the horses moved restlessly in their barn, safe and warm, but still carrying within them the memory of wild places and unbounded freedom. Like the women she'd taught, they had learned to balance civilization with wildness, safety with adventure, acceptance with authenticity. As midnight chimed from the church bell tower, Cynthia Foster, no longer Morrison, no longer defined by her marriage or her fertility, smiled into the darkness. She had gone to the mountains seeking a child and returned with something far more precious, the knowledge that every woman carries within herself the power to give birth to her own authentic life. The miracle wasn't in the baby she'd never conceived, but in the woman she'd finally allowed herself to become. And that miracle, shared with every woman brave enough to embrace it, would echo through generations in ways that no single birth could ever achieve. But the greatest test of Cynthia's transformation came unexpectedly the following spring, when a familiar figure appeared at her door on a rain-soaked April morning. Thomas Morrison stood on her porch, hat in hand, looking older and more weathered than she remembered. Behind him waited a carriage bearing the seal of the Denver Banking Association, suggesting his new position had brought him considerable success. "Cynthia," he said, his voice carrying none of the authority she remembered. "I hope you'll forgive the intrusion, but I need to see you." She invited him in, curiosity overriding the awkwardness of their situation. In her comfortable parlor, surrounded by the evidence of the life she'd built, photographs of her students, books on horse training and women's education, correspondence from Helen at medical school, Thomas seemed diminished somehow, like a man who had achieved everything he thought he wanted, only to discover it wasn't enough. "You look well," he observed, his gaze taking in her confident bearing, her practical but elegant clothing, the way she moved through her own space with complete ownership. "Different, but well." "I am well," she replied simply. "Perhaps for the first time in my adult life." Thomas nodded slowly, his fingers working the brim of his hat. "I came to apologize for the way I treated you, for the expectations I placed on you, for failing to see who you really were beneath who I needed you to be." His voice grew thick with emotion. "I've had 2 years to think about what I lost when I let you go, and I've come to understand that I lost the most remarkable woman I've ever known." The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with regret and recognition. Cynthia felt a flicker of the old sympathy she'd once carried for this man who had been as trapped by social expectations as she had been. "Though in different ways, Thomas," she said gently, "you didn't lose me. You never really had me. We were both playing roles we thought we were supposed to play, trying to build a life based on other people's definitions of success and happiness. But we could try again," he said, leaning forward with desperate hope. "I've changed too, Cynthia. I've seen what the world looks like beyond Cedar Falls. Women in Denver are attending university, running businesses, making their own choices. I understand now that what you were asking for wasn't unreasonable. It was necessary. For a moment, Cynthia allowed herself to imagine what that might look like. Thomas had indeed changed. She could see it in the way he spoke to her as an equal rather than a possession, in his acknowledgement of her autonomy, in his recognition that she had built something valuable without him. In another life, perhaps they could have found their way to genuine partnership, but too much had shifted in the landscape of her heart. The woman who had once loved Thomas Morrison had been someone else entirely, someone defined by her relationships rather than her own achievements, someone who measured her worth by external validation rather than internal satisfaction. "I'm grateful that you've grown," she told him honestly. "And I'm grateful for the years we shared, because they taught me what I didn't want as much as what I did. But Thomas, I'm not the same woman who left Cedar Falls 3 years ago. The life I've built here, the work I'm doing, the person I've become, I can't give that up, not even for the possibility of what we might have been." Thomas's face fell, but there was acceptance in his expression rather than anger. "You're happy here, really happy, deeply happy. Purposefully happy, happy in ways I never knew were possible." He stood to leave, pausing at the door to look back at her one final time. "I hope you know that despite everything, I'm proud of what you've accomplished. The woman I married was extraordinary, but the woman you've become, she's remarkable." After he left, Cynthia stood at her window, watching his carriage disappear down the muddy street. She felt no regret, no second thoughts about her choice. If anything, the encounter had confirmed what she'd suspected for months, that the life she'd built was so fulfilling, so aligned with her authentic self, that even the prospect of reclaiming her past held no appeal. That afternoon brought a different kind of visitor, a delegation of women from Colorado Springs who had traveled to Cedar Falls specifically to meet her. Led by Mrs. Adelaide Thornton, a suffragist and women's rights advocate, they represented a network of reformers working to expand opportunities for women throughout the territory. "We've heard remarkable things about your work here," Mrs. Thornton explained as they sat in Cynthia's parlor. "Not just the riding school, but the broader impact you've had on your community. We're organizing a conference this summer on women's education and economic independence, and we'd like you to be one of our featured speakers." The invitation was both thrilling and terrifying. Speaking to women in Cedar Falls was one thing. Addressing a conference of educated activists from across the region was quite another. But as Cynthia considered the proposal, she realized this was the natural evolution of her work, sharing what she'd learned not just with individual women seeking transformation, but with organized groups working to create systemic change. "What would you want me to speak about?" she asked. "Your story," Mrs. Thornton replied immediately. "How you transformed not just yourself but an entire community. How you proved that women's liberation doesn't require abandoning family and community. It requires redefining what those things mean." The conference, held in Colorado Springs that July, drew nearly 300 women from across the American West. Cynthia's speech, titled "The Quiet Revolution, Transforming Lives One Woman at a Time," became one of the most talked about presentations of the event. She spoke about the power of authentic living, the importance of supporting other women's dreams, and the revolutionary potential of communities that valued women's contributions beyond their reproductive capabilities. But perhaps more importantly, she spoke about the false choice society presented to women, between being dutiful wives and mothers or becoming isolated rebels. Her work in Cedar Falls had proven there was a third path, creating communities where women could fulfill their authentic selves while building meaningful connections with others. The response was overwhelming. Women approached her throughout the conference, sharing their own stories of transformation and seeking advice about creating similar programs in their own communities. By the time she returned to Cedar Falls, Cynthia carried with her not just the satisfaction of having shared her message with a broader audience, but also a network of like-minded women working towards similar goals across the territory. The ripple effects of that conference were immediate and far-reaching. Within months, riding schools modeled on Cynthia's program had opened in 3 other Colorado towns. A women's education society had formed in Denver, specifically focused on practical skills that would enable economic independence. Even more significantly, several territorial legislators had taken notice of the growing women's movement and begun drafting bills that would expand women's property, rights and educational opportunities. As autumn arrived and Helen returned from her first year of medical school, now confident, poised, and more determined than ever to become a doctor, Cynthia reflected on how far they'd all come. Her boarding house was fully booked through the winter, with women seeking various forms of transformation. Her riding school had a waiting list of students from as far away as Kansas and New Mexico. Most importantly, the culture of Cedar Falls itself had shifted so dramatically that young women growing up there would never face the same limitations that had once constrained their mothers and older sisters. But it was a letter that arrived in October that truly measured the scope of change Cynthia had initiated. The correspondence came from Catherine Whitmore, the woman Dakota had told her about years earlier, the banker's wife who had sought treatment for barrenness and instead discovered her calling as a teacher. Dear Miss Foster, the letter began, "I hope you'll forgive this correspondence from a stranger, but Mr. Reed shared your story with me during his recent visit to San Francisco, and I felt compelled to write. Like you, I once believed my worth was measured by my ability to bear children. Like you, I discovered that true fulfillment came from nurturing the potential I saw in others rather than producing biological offspring. I wanted you to know that the work you're doing in Cedar Falls has inspired similar efforts here in California. I've established a school for immigrant girls that focuses not just on English and basic education, but on practical skills that will enable them to support themselves independent of marriage. We teach bookkeeping, typewriting, basic medical training, and yes, horseback riding. The confidence these young women gain from mastering their own bodies and their own horses translates into every other aspect of their lives. More importantly, I wanted to thank you for proving that the choice I made 3 years ago to leave my marriage and pursue my calling was not an aberration or a failure, but part of a larger movement of women claiming their right to authentic lives. Your example has given courage to countless women who might otherwise have remained trapped in circumstances that diminished their spirits. Please know that your influence extends far beyond the boundaries of your immediate community. You are part of a sisterhood of women who are quietly revolutionizing what it means to be female in America, and history will remember your contributions long after conventional society has forgotten the names of women who lived only to please others. With deep respect and gratitude, Catherine Whitmore. The letter moved Cynthia to tears, not of sadness, but of profound recognition that her individual journey toward authenticity had become part of something much larger than herself. Across the country, women were making similar choices, supporting each other's growth and creating communities where female potential could flourish without apology. That winter brought news that Helen had been accepted for advanced medical training under Dr. Emily Blackwell herself, making her one of only 12 women in the program. Emma Patterson had been offered a teaching position at a progressive school in Denver that encouraged innovative educational methods. Rebecca Walsh had opened a 3rd boarding house and was being courted by investors interested in franchising her business model across the Western Territories. But perhaps the most meaningful development was the arrival of Cynthia's first granddaughter, not a biological descendant, but something even more precious. Margaret Clearwater's daughter, inspired by the transformation she'd witnessed in her mother, had defied her father's wishes and enrolled in Teachers College. When she returned to Cedar Falls for Christmas break, she sought out Cynthia immediately. "Miss Foster," young Sarah Clearwater said, her eyes bright with determination, "I want to thank you for showing my mother that it was never too late to become who she was meant to be. Watching her discover her own strength gave me permission to pursue my own dreams. I'm going to be a teacher, but more than that, I'm going to be the kind of teacher who helps other young women understand that they can choose their own paths in life. As Cynthia looked at this confident young woman who had grown up witnessing female empowerment, rather than female submission, she understood that the true measure of her success lay not in the individual women she'd helped transform, but in the generation of girls who would inherit a world where such transformation was possible, even expected. The year ended with Dakota's proposal, not of marriage in the conventional sense, but of partnership in its truest form. He asked her to consider combining their work, creating a network of ranches and educational centers across the Mountain West, where women could learn not just riding and self-reliance, but the broader skills needed to build independent, fulfilling lives. We could reach hundreds of women, he explained as they sat by her fireplace on New Year's Eve. Create a whole system of support for women who want to choose authenticity over conformity. As midnight approached and the church bells of Cedar Falls rang in the new century, Cynthia Foster, teacher, mentor, revolutionary, looked toward a future bright with possibility. She had sought a child and found instead a calling that would outlive any single life. She had discovered that the greatest miracle wasn't in creating new life, but in helping existing life flourish according to its own nature. The baby she'd never conceived lived in every woman who learned to trust her own judgment, in every girl who grew up believing in her own capabilities, in every community that valued female contribution beyond traditional roles. Her legacy wasn't written in birth records, but in the transformed lives of women who had found the courage to become themselves. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.